In this video, we're going to talk about the age-old question, is the turntable an instrument?
Turntable was originally something you walked away from when you put a record on, you know? You never thought to sit there and look at it and say, what else can I do with this?
I got the juice like that.
You're not supposed to, you never were supposed to touch it.
Yeah, it was
Your
so...
parents were like, don't touch the turntable.
Yeah.
Don't touch the record. You're going to ruin it.
I'd like to look at this in more detail and see if we can answer questions like, can anything be a musical instrument? And if so, what are the criteria? If the turntable is an instrument, which one is it most like? And why has the turntable flourished when so many newfangled instruments that came out in the 20th century have faltered? If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, feel free to hang around to the end of the video.
Catch what I'm playing. Catch what I'm playing. Catch what I'm playing.
Technically, pretty much anything could be an instrument. All of the above are essentially found instruments and are clearly making music. The turntable is slightly more complicated as it was actually designed to play music in the first place.
You know what this is, don't you? It's a phonograph, considered a miracle of the time when your grandfather was alive.
So that begs the obvious question. If I take this record and put it on a turntable, does that make me a musician?
Up. I brought along.
Clearly not, but that can make it harder for people to understand when a DJ might claim to play the turntable and that the turntable is in fact a musical instrument. So where do we draw the line? This is funny. And are there a set criteria that needs to be met before we can call an object an instrument? Where's my book? So I've been reading this book by Katz called Groove Music, the art and culture of the hip-hop DJ. It's an amazing book and I've got a lot of the information that I talk about in this video from this particular book, so go and check it out. Katz is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina. He's also a violinist, a radio DJ and an aspiring turntablist. So if anyone can answer this question, I believe this is the guy to do it. So what are the criteria he sets out? It needs to involve real-time sound manipulation. It has to have a body of techniques specifically developed for that object or instrument. It has to have its own unique sound. The object itself has to be designed specifically for making music or modified to make music. And finally, the sound it generates has to be considered music by a community of people. Let's look at those criteria again through the lens of the turntable. So does the turntable involve real-time sound manipulation? Even the most early turntablist techniques involve real-time sound manipulation. So let's think about like Grandmaster Flash when he's looping records. He demonstrated backspinning, slip cueing, punch phrasing and stuff like that.
The Grandmaster.
Since then, turntablist techniques have come on leaps and bounds, and you've got things like scratching, beat juggling, trick mixing, which segues us quite nicely into the next set of criteria, which is it has a body of techniques developed for it. So this is a pretty easy one. Let's look at scratching, for example. You've got babies, forwards, stabs, crabs, flares, tears. You know, the list goes on and on. And then when it comes to juggling, you've got stuff like chasing or strobing. You've got swing patterns, doubling, tripling, and there's a whole lexicon made for those particular techniques. So let's look at the next criteria, that it has its own distinct sound. And again, I think this one's quite easy to argue. There's not a whole lot of things which sound like scratching, and I'll return to this later on in the video where I examine what instruments it sounds like most. And to give you an example, we can use Herbie Hancock Rocket, which is where turntablism or scratching really hit the mainstream. Here's a clip of Mixmaster Mike from the Beastie Boys talking about it in the movie Scratch.
It was just so futuristic at its time. Who would have thought? I mean, there's people playing the trumpet, drums, but I just knew that this is something different. Hey, I want to move the record back and forth in my own way.
As turntablist and battle champion Rob Swift puts it, talking about Grand Mixer DXT, it is a vital part of the song, and if you take his scratches out, then something's missing. I always knew the turntable was a musical instrument, but to me, he was the first one to prove it. The sound of beat juggling is also very unique to the turntable. I think it's really hard to think of any other instrument where you can take existing rhythms and sounds and remix them live like you can beat juggling. So the next point is the object itself is either specifically designed or modified for making music. So this is where some confusion might come in. Obviously, the turntable was made for playing music, not necessarily playing music in the way turntablists like to use it today. And that leads us on to the modifying aspect. These days we have tons of different turntables and mixers that we can use to play music, but this wasn't always the case. For instance, early DJ pioneers had to invent the slip mat to allow us to basically slip cue our records. DJs had to go to great lengths to modify their turntables and their mixers, rewiring them and the like.
Actually, the first particular mixer that I had was by Sony. It was a Sony MX-8. It was an 8-channel mic mixer. And what I had to do is build an external cueing system. So what I did is I went to Radio Shack and bought what's called a single pole double throw switch. And what I did is I crazy glued it to the top of the mixer. The mixers of that time didn't have crossfaders, so I was actually doing it with an up and down sort of mixer.
It wasn't until the 1990s that a lot of the features that we take for granted now were actually introduced by companies like Stax. So the next point is the sound that it generates is considered to be music by a whole community of people. Since the early days of hip hop, there's been a whole community of people which consider the sound that the turntables are making to be music. B-boys, B-girls, MCs, DJs, they've all been vibing to turntable music for a very long time now. It was around 1994 when DJs who were using the turntable as an instrument got their name, turntablists. The term was said to be originally coined by DJ Babu of the Beat Junkies.
I told him that, and he goes, you know what, man, I'm not even gonna call myself DJ Babu anymore. I'm just gonna be called, like J. Rue calls himself the Damager, I'm gonna be called Babu the Turntablist. And that's what it was. It was something I'd write on my mixtapes. It was something I named myself.
You could even make an argument that the turntable has been used to make music even before the 1970s. Early experimental music practitioners like John Cage were doing stuff with the turntable way, way before then. So by now, I hope that I've convinced you that the turntable is an instrument, at least in the right hands. Which leads me on to my next pondering, which is, if the turntable is an instrument, which instrument is it most like? Luckily, Mark Katz wrote about this in his book. Johnny Juice Rosado from Public Enemy said that he thinks scratching reminds him of the cuica. I don't know how you say that, probably cuica? And it's a Brazilian drum that creates a really characteristic squeaking by pulling a stick through the drum head. Mark Katz himself, as I mentioned before, is a violinist, and he thinks that scratching is like bowing. Grand Mixer DST saw this similarity himself.
The record never spun one time, never made one rotation. And that's what made me stop calling it a turntable. I started to call it a turn fiddle because basically the wax was my bow. Because Quincy Jones came to the rehearsal and he pulled up a chair, spun it around, sat it, straddled it, and looked at me and he went, "Go ahead." And then he looked, he watched the whole thing, and he got up and he bear hugged me. And he said, "Man, that's something. Like you're actually playing the turntable. You're not letting the record play. You're playing the record."
I've also asked some turntablists this question in the past, and I can share their thoughts and ideas now.
I would say Macam Arabic keyboard playing. No, like I don't do that shit, but it's a particular style of keyboard playing where they only use one hand, and that's on the keys. And then they have a little fader on the left, which is a pitch bend fader, and they flex with that. I'll show you some shit, but it's like.
I think all of these examples are really interesting, and you can definitely see the direct comparison between all of them and scratching. One hand is being used to create the sound, and the other hand is being used to modulate it. Let me know in the comments what instrument you think the turntable sounds like. As mentioned in the introduction, almost any item can be seen as a musical instrument. Why then has the turntable flourished over the past few decades when so many other instruments which have been introduced in the 21st century have fallen by the wayside? I'm going to refer to Mark Katz here again, and he argues that it's the turntable's physical immediacy. The hand rests comfortably on the grooved, slightly tacky surface of the record. The tactility is enormously important to DJs who wax lyrically about the intimate feel of vinyl. Pushing a record under a turntable needle, transforming the music held within its grooves, one has a sense of touching sound. As a DJ myself, I can definitely testify this. There's some little haptic feedback that when you're scratching a record, you can actually feel under the grooves the sound, and that's like something which is very hard to replicate. Mark Katz then goes on to argue that its simplicity is another reason for its success. For the most part, a DJ chooses from analog binaries. Push or pull on the record, on or off on the crossfader, turntable 1 or 2. Like many successful instruments, the turntable's simplicity still yields infinite results.
It's like a violin drum. and it's like a flying bird. It's like a rapping. It's like a picture. It's so many things. It's multiple poetries. So it's like drawing with sound. And it's got in so many aspects, unfathomable depths.
The turntable is little more than a moving platter. It's essentially a motor and a tone arm, and it has very few moving parts that can go wrong, essentially. The turntable has survived because it was created in large quantities and is readily available. Unlike many now obsolete musical instruments, it hasn't had to rely on one or two dedicated makers to keep making them. While no instrument is guaranteed to survive, a hardy, relatively simple one like the turntable stands much better chances. I had a whole section here on why the turntable was first adopted in the Bronx in the 1970s, but it started to make the video pretty long, and it could be a whole video in itself, to be honest. So if you think that's something that you'd like to see, drop it in the comments and I'll try to get around to making it, but only if there's enough people who think that it would be interesting. So is a turntable a musical instrument? I think Grand Wizard Theodore sums it up pretty well here. He said, "I knew that it was music when people danced to it." Again, Mark Katz writes, "For decades now, people have heard the distinctive sounds of the turntable as instrument and have danced, bobbed heads, or stood transfixed in awe, just like anyone might do in the presence of any other kind of music. They have thought of and experienced these sounds as music, and in the end, that's how we know that the turntable is a musical instrument." But I think that the turntable will always remain a complex case. If I take a record and just put it on the platter to listen, the turntable is still a listening device. If I feel inspired to scratch the record, however, before playing it, the turntable turns from a playback device to an instrument and back again within a few seconds. Ironically, it's the turntable's sheer diversity of sonic abilities, its ability to sound like anything else, that not only makes it an instrument of infinite possibilities, but also brings its very instrumentality into question. If the turntable suffers from an identity crisis, it's because it actually has two identities. So, do you agree that the turntable is a musical instrument? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to drop a like to let YouTube know that this is a good video and that it should show it to more people. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.